What if one decision on a stormy night changed your life forever? Imagine driving home after a long day, the rain pounding against your windshield, the road ahead a dark, shadowy tunnel. Out of nowhere, you see her, a frail, elderly woman, soaked to the bone, waving desperately under a flickering streetlight. Would you stop? Would you let her in? I did, and that decision still haunts me. In today's video, we dive into a story of eerie encounters, unanswered questions, and the thin line between the living and the dead. Stay with me as we unravel the chilling events that began on a rain-drenched road and ended with a ghostly figure I'll never forget. Are you ready for a journey that might make you think twice about late-night drives? Let's begin. A frightful journey in the rain. The rain poured relentlessly that night, drumming against my windshield as I navigated my way home. After an exhausting day at work, all I wanted was to slip into the comfort of my warm bed. The road ahead was the familiar Scenic Drive, a picturesque route during the day but a shadowy labyrinth at night. The trees lining the road seemed to huddle together, their dark silhouettes stretching into the sky. The occasional street lamp illuminated the path, casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. As I passed a well-known deli, its parking lot nearly deserted in the downpour, a figure under one of the flickering streetlights caught my eye. It was an elderly woman, tall and frail, her arm raised in a wave. The rain soaked her thin frame, and her movements seemed desperate. My first instinct was to drive past. Picking up strangers in the dead of night was against everything I'd been taught. But something about her made me hesitate. She looked vulnerable, almost ghostly against the glow of the streetlight. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the rain spray into the car. "Do you need a ride?" I called out hesitantly. Her face lit up with gratitude as she nodded vigorously. I opened the passenger door and she climbed in, water dripping from her soaked clothes onto the seat. Her hair was disheveled, strands clinging to her face, and her trembling hands clutched an old, weathered handbag. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice a curious mix of sweetness and age-worn raspiness. "I'm trying to get back to town. It's so hard to find a ride in this weather." I nodded and focused on the road, but I couldn't ignore the peculiar presence beside me. Her features were strikingly odd. Deep wrinkles etched into her pale skin, a mouth missing a few teeth, and eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light of the dashboard. Despite her strange appearance, she exuded an air of profound loneliness. I felt a pang of sympathy and decided it was only right to help her. We exchanged a few words as the car's heater filled the cabin with warmth. She spoke of her life, though her words were cryptic, as if she were guarding secrets. She mentioned a family she hadn't seen in years, and a home she'd long since left behind. Her voice wavered with emotion, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to her story, though it left more questions than answers. As we approached a gas station, I realized the needle on my fuel gauge was perilously close to empty. I pulled in and turned to her. "I need to refuel. Would you like to come inside to stay warm?" She shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "I'll wait here." "You go ahead." Something in her tone was unsettling, but I brushed it off. Grabbing my wallet, I stepped out into the rain and hurried toward the bright lights of the convenience store. The rain was icy, soaking through my jacket as I quickly paid and returned to the car. When I opened the driver's door, my heart skipped a beat. The seat beside me was empty. The old woman was gone. I froze, my hand still gripping the door. The rain continued to fall, but the car's interior was eerily still. My eyes darted around the parking lot, searching for any sign of her, but the area was deserted. A chill ran down my spine as the realization set in. There was no way she could have left without me seeing her. The windows had been locked and I had been gone only a few minutes. Panic began to creep in. I stepped out and called into the night, "Hello? Are you there?" The rain swallowed my voice. and the only answer was the rhythmic patter of droplets on the asphalt. I checked the back seat and even the trunk, but she was nowhere to be found. Her presence, once tangible and unsettling, now felt like a haunting memory. I couldn't shake the cold fear coiling in my stomach. Returning to the driver's seat, I sat for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities. Had she been a figment of my imagination? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or was there something more unexplainable at play? As I started the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the dashboard, where the old woman had rested her hands, was a small puddle of water, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the impression of skeletal fingers. I drove home in a haze, the rain now feeling oppressive rather than comforting. Every shadow on the road seemed to shift, and every sound made me flinch. When I finally reached my house, I parked the car and bolted inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of my living room offered little solace as I sat in silence, replaying the night's events over and over. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the experience. The details of the woman's face haunted me, her voice echoing in my mind. I even returned to the deli and gas station, hoping for some explanation. But no one had seen her. The mystery consumed me, and I began researching local legends and ghost stories. What I found sent shivers down my spine. Scenic Drive had a dark history, marked by numerous accidents and disappearances. One story stood out. Decades ago, a woman had been struck by a car on that very stretch of road. She had been trying to hitch a ride in the rain, and the driver, blinded by the storm, hadn't seen her until it was too late. Witnesses claimed her spirit still lingered, seeking a way back to town. The thought chilled me to the bone. Was the woman I'd picked up that night the same spirit? Had I unwittingly encountered something beyond the realm of the living? The idea seemed absurd, but the events of that night defied any logical explanation. Even now, every time I drive down Scenic Drive, I feel a weight in the air, as if I'm being watched. I've learned to avoid the road on rainy nights, but the memory of her face, her voice, and the inexplicable way she vanished lingers. It's a story I'll carry with me forever, a reminder of how thin the veil between our world and the unknown can truly be. The nightmare in the bedroom. I stumbled into my house that night, soaked to the bone and shaken to my core. Every nerve in my body felt raw, like a live wire sparking with tension. After changing out of my wet clothes, I swallowed a melatonin tablet, hoping it would lull me into some much-needed rest. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan slicing through the dark, my mind refused to quiet down. The events of the night replayed in an endless loop. The woman's haunting eyes, her sudden disappearance, and the chilling imprint on the dashboard. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, a steady rhythm tapping against my bedroom window. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that it had all been a bizarre coincidence. Just as I was on the verge of drifting off, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against a wall. I froze, straining to listen. It must be coming from the upstairs neighbors, I told myself. This was an old apartment building. Noises traveled easily through the thin walls, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, "just the wind or a draft." Summoning my courage, I stood and crept to the door, placing my ear against the wood. Silence. Feeling foolish, I returned to bed, pulling the blanket tightly around me. Sleep came in fits, a restless tossing and turning that felt more like waiting than resting. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I jolted awake. The room was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyelids even when they're open. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. My eyes darted around the room, and then I saw it. In the farthest corner, where the shadows were deepest, was the outline of a figure. It was her, the old woman from the car. She sat huddled on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, her head tilted as if she were studying me. Her wet hair clung to her gaunt face, and her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened as I clutched the blanket, hoping it would somehow shield me. The figure began to move, slowly uncurling and rising to her feet. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Just as she reached the edge of my bed, she stopped. Her gaze bore into mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked out of the room. The door didn't creak. The floor didn't groan. It was as if she floated away, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed, I stumbled to the light switch and flicked it on. The sudden brightness was both a relief and a shock, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I searched every corner of the room, then the entire apartment, but there was no trace of her. No wet footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Before crawling back into bed, I locked the bedroom door, wedged a chair under the handle, and double-checked every window. Exhausted, I fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by vivid dreams of her face. The next morning, I woke with a start. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt almost mocking, as if the terror of the night before had been nothing more than a nightmare. But as I prepared to leave for work, the unease returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. When I stepped outside and approached my car, my heart sank. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and as I opened the driver's door, the musty smell of damp fabric wafted out. My stomach churned as I looked into the back seat. There, clear as day, were dark, wet stains on the upholstery, proof that someone or something had been sitting there. But that wasn't the worst of it. My blanket, the one I kept in the back seat for emergencies, was gone. It had been there the night before when I picked her up. Now it had vanished without a trace. I slammed the door shut and leaned against the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with questions, but no answers came. All I knew was that she had been there, in my car, watching, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to drive that day. Instead, I called a cab and spent the ride to work, staring out the window, half expecting to see her face reflected in the glass. That night, I avoided going home until it was absolutely necessary, dreading the possibility of another encounter. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences continued. Lights in my apartment flickered unpredictably. Objects moved from where I had left them. And at night, I often felt the same suffocating presence that had gripped me in the bedroom. I started to question my sanity, wondering if stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But the final straw came one night when I found a single muddy footprint on my kitchen floor. It was small, delicate, as if left by someone barefoot. And beside it, on the counter, was my missing blanket, damp and reeking of rain. I knew then that this wasn't just my imagination. She was real, and she wasn't going away. The mysterious answer. Months passed, but the memory of that night clung to me like a shadow. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was a mix of exhaustion, paranoia, and coincidence. Yet the strange occurrences in my apartment and the damp blanket that inexplicably returned told a different story. They were undeniable signs of something unearthly. One evening, over drinks, I recounted my experience to a friend, hoping to hear them laugh it off and ease my lingering fear. Instead, their face grew serious as they listened. When I finished, they leaned in, their voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've heard about her," they said. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" They explained that Scenic Road was infamous for a local legend. Decades ago, a woman had perished in a car accident near the woods bordering the road. It was a stormy night, much like the one I described. Witnesses claimed she had been trying to hitch a ride when a car, blinded by the rain, struck her down. Ever since, stories of a ghostly figure waving for help on rainy nights had circulated among locals. But there's more, my friend continued. The people who stop to help her, they're never the same after. Some say she leaves a part of herself with them, like she's tied to them somehow. They start noticing strange things, objects moving, shadows lurking, nightmares that feel too real. It's as if she's looking for something or someone. A chill ran down my spine as their words sank in. Everything they described mirrored what I had been experiencing. Do they ever get rid of her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My friend hesitated. The stories don't say. But I've heard one thing. If you see her again, don't let her inside, no matter what. After that conversation, I became hyper-aware of every little noise and shadow around me. The weight of her presence seemed to grow stronger, especially on rainy nights. The sound of rain against the window now filled me with dread, a stark reminder of the night I had made the fateful decision to help her. Desperate for answers, I began digging into the history of Scenic Road. Through old newspaper archives and local forums, I pieced together the story. Her name was Margaret Hollis, a widow who had lived alone in a small cabin deep in the woods. One stormy evening in 1978, she had ventured out to buy supplies. On her way back, she was struck by a car while walking along the roadside. The driver fled the scene, leaving her to die alone in the rain. What struck me most was the detail of her death. Witnesses reported that she had been waving frantically for help moments before the accident. Even after her death, some claimed to have seen her figure on the side of the road, her arm outstretched as if still pleading for someone to stop. The more I read, the more I felt the pieces falling into place. Margaret wasn't just a lost soul. She was searching for something or someone to help her move on. But why me? Why had she chosen my car that night? Determined to find closure, I decided to visit the spot where she had died. Armed with a flashlight and a bundle of sage I had read was used in cleansing rituals, I ventured out on a rainy evening, the kind she was known to appear on. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of raindrops on my umbrella. When I reached the spot where the accident had supposedly occurred, I stopped. The woods loomed dark and foreboding on either side of the road. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I lit the sage, its smoke curling into the damp air, and spoke aloud, my voice trembling. Margaret Hollis, if you can hear me, I'm here to help. Please let me understand what you need. The rain seemed to intensify, drumming against the leaves overhead. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a faint figure emerging from the trees. It was her. She looked just as she had that night, soaked and frail, her eyes hollow yet piercing. My body locked in fear as she approached, her form gliding rather than walking. But instead of stopping, she reached out and placed her hand on my arm. A sudden, overwhelming wave of sadness washed over me, and in that moment, I understood. She wasn't malevolent. She was trapped in a cycle of despair and longing. She wanted justice for the way she had died and acknowledgement of her existence. She had been forgotten by the living, her story reduced to whispers and urban legends. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You didn't deserve to be left behind." Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of peace in her eyes. Her form began to fade, dissolving into the rain until there was nothing left but the sound of water hitting the pavement. The drive home felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. The strange occurrences in my apartment ceased after that night. The blanket in my car never reappeared, and the dampness I had come to associate with her vanished. But even now, every time I pass Scenic Road, I can't help but glance at the shadows along the roadside, half expecting to see her standing there. I tell myself that she's finally at rest, that she's found the peace she was searching for. Yet, a small part of me wonders, if the rain falls hard enough, will I see her again? Thank you for watching today's story. I hope these chilling experiences have made you reflect on fears and trust in life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on more engaging stories and interesting content in the future. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.